Hello and welcome once again to Latveria Library, where I talk about all my favorite comics. Now today's video has been asked for by you guys more than any other. Part 3 of my favorite stories involving everyone's favorite loudmouth chain-smoking British conman, John Constantine. I know you guys probably just want to start the story, so I'll keep the intro short and just get into it. From last we left off, I had just finished the first story in Garth Ennis' run. Constantine had beat cancer and almost started a war between heaven and hell, with Earth caught in the middle, by tricking the three lords of hell, which has to be one of Constantine's best stories. But now we're going to skip a few more issues, and move on to issue 59. This is where the story Guys and Dolls starts. But before we get into it, I want to at least mention Royal Blood. Although it isn't one of my favorites, it's still a really good story all of you guys should check out. I won't spoil anything, but it involves billionaires and their wicked appetites. Now, Guys and Dolls. It's a story I can't wait to get into, because it's definitely one of my favorites. It all starts on issue 59, with the first of the Fallen, now self-proclaimed ruler of hell since Lucifer has left, looking for a succubus named Chantel. He was told by the Worm Queen she could help him with his Constantine problem. But unfortunately for him, her and the chain-smoking conman were closer than he was led to believe. From the moment she saw Satan moving towards her, she could tell what he wanted, what he was planning, and what he would do to her. So she took off, jumping through worlds just to escape his grasp. Satan then began to fill with furious rage. He hunted down Triskel, the Worm Queen of the Succubi. This was her fault. She had promised him Chantel would help, telling him that she knew the enemy and feel free to use her against him. But the Worm Queen never knew. How could she know how close Chantel and Constantine were? Chantel had finally reached her destination and had found Constantine. There was no turning back now. She had left her home and would never be able to return. If she did, Satan would find out how her and Constantine had met, and that wouldn't be good for anyone. So her best chance at living would be to team up with him instead of in hell. The only thing left to do now was find a place for her to hide out. So John rents out an Airbnb, and after they settled in and catched up for a bit, Chantel begins to tell him everything. That Satan was forming a plan to untangle Constantine's thoughtless trap. He wasn't like Lucifer, who would just get bored and move on after a while. No, Satan, the serpent in the garden, would chase him for eternity, never giving up until Constantine begs for what Christ got. But John didn't seem too worried. The way he saw it was that she really needed him more than he needed her. And she already owed him. But now, after this, she owed him big time. Whatever he wanted, nothing would be too big of an ask, which she agreed to. We then cut to the past to when Chantel met Constantine, plus a secret they didn't want hell to know. John gets a knock on the door. It was a man with his pregnant girlfriend. They wanted his help. But John wasn't a doctor. The couple had to have the wrong guy. But then the man and his girlfriend showed their true forms, and he kind of got it. John then rushed them inside. His curiosity always got the better of him, especially in those days. An angel impregnating a succubus? He had to know how this happened. But it was much simpler than you would have thought. Basically, no succubus has ever snared an angel, but to Chantel it seemed like too good to miss. A coup like that would greatly advance her status in hell. So she hunted down an angel, shut off a little leg, and boom, worked easier than expected. Unfortunately, she didn't expect to fall in love with him, and vice versa. John pretty much got the rest. She got pregnant, and now neither side is all too thrilled about it. He honestly didn't want to get involved. This was way above his pay grade. But Chantel was quite convincing. She was a succubus after all. Using her power of seduction, she was able to convince him pretty quick. And besides, now an angel and a succubus owe him a favor. So John and Chaz took them to an abandoned house owned by a friend for them to hold up in. John covered it in a magical barrier that would hide them from Hell's spies. The only thing now was to come up with a plan and find out what he was up against. So he called in a few favors. The main doctor at a hospital for the criminally insane owed him one, or rather he was blackmailing him. Either way, this gave John access to a patient who we will say liked kids way too much. The man had also been possessed by a demon, but the two were more partners than anything, so John had no sympathy for him. He actually hated being in their presence. It was like drinking piss, as he had put it, but it was necessary. Come to find out, Gout, the demon, had no idea about the angel and succubus. Hell was completely in the dark. So who did that leave? Who were they running from? John walked up the steps to the old abandoned safe house and suddenly heard screaming coming from the inside. The succubus was in labor. He was at a loss. He had no idea what to do, but someone else did. Someone that wouldn't allow this. But it wasn't Hell, because they had no idea. Suddenly 7 angels appeared outside. John was so busy dealing with Hell, he forgot about the other side. They completely disintegrate the father, then watched and waited as Chantal writhed in pain. Even the angel of mercy. John had heard banshees, Hell's teeth crunching shut on innocent souls, and even the devil hissing in his ear. But none of that compared to the burst scream of what wasn't meant to be. It left a scar across his soul. After it was over, the angels took the child. Whatever it was, John prayed to God that they killed it. But at the same time, he hoped it was still alive. Chantal had made it home and gotten off scot-free. She owed him for that, even if it did make him feel like shit. We then cut back to the present. Chantal knew John was planning something for Satan. It was written all over his face, and a favor he would ask afterwards would be huge. There was a war coming between Satan and John. It may not happen for years, but he had to be ready. And if she knew what John would ask of her, God knows what she would try. Meanwhile, down in Hell, Satan was cleaning up some loose ends. Basically, any demon that would stand in his way of revenge on John, which meant getting rid of Nargal. It took Nargal 10,000 years to become a demon, and in a blink of an eye, Satan had taken it away. But fortunately, he had eternity to work his way back up, as he was ripped apart over and over again. But Satan just couldn't enjoy it like he used to. Actually, all the pleasures of Hell were hollow these days, and it would be that way until he could defeat his adversary. It's all he thought about. That moment of John giving him the finger constantly torments him. The next day on Earth. Since seeing Chantal again, it got John thinking about their past, and how lucky he is to have Kit. He sat and watched her as she drew, and thought he could do this forever. For once in his life, he was happy. On the opposite side, it made Chantal think about how alone she's been for so long, and how she missed the love of her life, Tali. She remembered how his eyes were like pools of dew, and his smile was like the morning. She remembered holding him and kissing him like it was yesterday. She then looked over at John and tried to figure out what he was thinking. Would he actually save her? And what price would she pay afterwards? Turns out he had come up with a plan. He knew she wouldn't like it, but it was the only way. Meanwhile, back in Hell, Satan had spent 3 hours looking for the succubus, with no luck. The Worm Queen asked what it even mattered, but she was with Constantine. He knew that Satan would find a way around their bargain one day. In fact, he was probably planning for it, and he could use the succubus against him. That's when the looking pool finally picked up her location. John was at the old abandoned house he had taken Chantal to last time they saw each other. And just like last time, there was blood all over the walls and floor. Another death had occurred here. We move outside to John covered in blood smoking a cigarette, waiting for Satan to arrive. At that moment, a shadow moved from around the corner into John's view. His wait was finally over, and he had already won. It was like this. Right before Satan and the Worm Queen arrived, her view of Chantal had been obscured by a masking sigil. Apparently John had cut it into her soul, and now they would never be able to find her again. John had beat the devil a 3rd time. Satan then was tempted to tear him apart, but he wasn't ready for what comes after. So they both just stared at each other for a second. They knew a war with Hell was coming. They didn't know when, but it would be sooner rather than later. Chantal had no scar from the operation, just like John had told her. Even though she was torn to pieces, he saved her. Unfortunately, she would never be able to go back home now. The sigil would destroy her the minute she entered the Inferno. She would never see her sisters again, or her queen. She was now a demon without a hell. But then she started to realize that this could be a new start. A second chance for a new heaven, where she could be happy. Constantine walks up and sits beside her. He wanted to make sure she was okay, which meant he wanted to make sure she could enact his favor. He then tells her what he wants. We as the reader don't get to hear it, but we know it involves seduction, betrayal, and a fall from grace. Chantel agrees to it, and John tells her he will get in touch with her within the year. And this ends Guys and Dolls. I think I really like this one because it's one of the only arcs in Hellblazer that has somewhat of a happy ending. John realizes how much he cares for Kit, how this was the first girl he could see himself spending the rest of his life with. And even Chantel found some semblance of peace by the end, even after everything. Unfortunately, the next story won't be like that, but at least we will get to see the favor Chantel promised Constantine. So yes, this will be a continuation of what I call the Satan Saga. Steve Dillon is also back doing the artwork, which is for me. I really missed the previous team's art. Their use of black and light blue during some of the quieter moments were executed perfectly. Like when John's alone with his thoughts, it perfectly captures that somber tone. And the detail they use in Hell make it look so grotesque, but beautiful. But let's move on. Once again, we're going to skip a few issues until we get to 64, in the beginning of the Fear and Loathing story arc. The Archangel Gabriel had done many good and horrible things in the name of God, without question. He never doubted his father's will, even after he was cast out. It wasn't until Constantine got into his head that he began to question. Gabriel had aligned himself with the leader of a neo-Nazi party named Charles Patterson. Constantine had visited them about 2 years ago, wanting help, which Gabriel declined. But then John had said something that bothered him ever since. Charles Patterson is a bully and a racist thug, a sinner. So why had Gabriel been allowed to talk to him? Why hadn't he at least been reprimanded? That one encounter made him question everything. If this was the Lord's will, why was he headed down such a strange direction? He needed some air and decided to take a walk to clear his troubled heart. Little did he know he was being watched. Gabriel walked through the streets of London. He looked upon all the sinners as he passed, but he couldn't look down on them anymore. The pride he treasured was gone ever since Constantine had planted that seed of doubt in his head. It was changing him. Suddenly, he bumped into a young lady walking by. She apologized to him, but Gabriel ignored her and kept walking. Under her breath, he could hear her calling him a rotten snob, same as what John always called him. He then stopped, turned, and apologized to her. They began to talk and hit it off. She could tell something was upsetting him, so she asked if he wanted to talk about it. It was the first bit of kindness he had had in a long time, so he agreed. She then told him her name was Julie. We finally check in on Constantine. He was making some kind of exchange with a priest at a diner near his apartment when two old friends, Dez and his brother George, walked in. He hadn't seen them since George moved to Brum in '89. Unfortunately, his place in Brum was burned down by some racist thug who was trying to light a cross in his front yard. At least the moron burned himself in the process. George and his friends then stayed for about another week until a petrol bomb was thrown through his window. It seemed that the National Front had been spreading out further, gaining more members. Even the priests said they had been spreading to Germany. At that very moment, John had gotten a phone call. Whoever it was on the other end seemed to have good news, because it sounded as if some scheme of his was going as planned, but more on that later. Meanwhile, Gabriel and Julie had found a nice diner to have a drink and chat at. He begins telling her all about his father, how him and his brothers tried to live up to his expectations, also how he may be in trouble with him because of something a man named Constantine had said to him. Gabriel had told Julie more tonight than he had ever even thought. She was just so easy to talk to. But Julie wasn't the only one listening. Patterson's man that had been following Gabriel reported back and told Patterson everything. That Gabriel had met a woman, damn near told her who he was, and how Constantine had been sticking his nose in the middle of their business. Patterson was furious, so he ordered his man to get a couple of thugs together and kill John's girl to teach him not to get in the middle of their affairs. Later, at Kit and John's apartment, Kit was on the phone with a friend when she gets a knock on the door. She thought it could be John, but why would he knock? Well, before she could get up and answer it, Patterson's thugs break the handle and start inside. She warned them to stay back, but it was no good. The bigger of the two move in closer. Kit then grabs a knife out of the sink and lunges forward, stabbing the thug in the groin. She did warn him after all. She wasted no time closing the distance between her and the smaller thug. She swiped her nails across his face, and he screamed in agony while the bigger thug made no sound. He just looked down and stared at his wound, in shock. Kit didn't wait around. She was long gone, and Patterson's plan had failed, so now he had no other choice. Meanwhile, John was walking with Dez. Dez was worried about the National Front. His mom had just been attacked by those racist idiots, and he didn't know what to do. John told him that he knew this little Nazi named Charlie Patterson. He was busy at the moment, but he could sniff around a bit, which was pretty funny, since a moment later Patterson's thugs rolled up and began to beat both of them with bats. Patterson planned on John being alone, but yells from his car to hurry up and just bring both of them. John then awakens tied to a chair, being smacked by Patterson. He tells John he should have stayed away from the Archangel, then pulls the hood off of Dez. Constantine's friend's face, or what little was left of it, had been shredded to pieces. John screamed in agony. He had seen a lot, but nothing this horrific. Who could do that to another human being? At that same moment, Dez's brother George had been looking for them all over town. He finally had a little luck at the diner from before. The waitress told him they had eaten there for lunch but hadn't been seen since. He could feel something was wrong. Plus, what one of the patrons had said worried him even more. John Constantine was bad luck. So just in case, he decided to pick up a sawed-off shotgun from a friend. We then cut to Gabriel and Julie. They had been spending a lot of time together since they bumped into each other. They walked and talked all through the day until after twilight. To passers-by, they looked like lovers. And Gabriel knew it. Not that he minded. She was so pure and good. Whatever his father intended humanity to be, she had to be it. The weight of guilt finally began to lift from his shoulders. For the first time, he felt love and was happy. Meanwhile, John had been left alone with Dez, who had died about an hour ago. He couldn't breathe with his throat crushed, and with a soft hiss, he was gone. Kit was next. He could feel something was wrong. He had let her down, but he knew that one day he would. John always did fail the ones he loved the most. Patterson then enters the room. He begins to give this big speech about how Constantine looks down on him, and how liberals are just as racist as he is. It's a really long speech, but to sum it up, Patterson was just gloating about capturing Constantine, and Constantine told him to stick it up his ass, then asked what he wanted with the snob. Basically, Patterson thought it wouldn't hurt to have some mystic clout, and you can't clout much harder than a fallen archangel. John tells him he would never be able to corrupt Gabriel, plus Patterson was already too late anyway. John had already gotten to him first. Now the angel had fallen, and John was about to serve him up to Patterson on a silver platter in exchange for his life. But first he needed him for something, then he was all Charlie's. But we all know John better than that. He had a plan, and Charlie was going down. While all that was going on, George had found another lead. Some drunk ran his mouth too much at a pub. George happened to overhear him and jumped him outside. He then begins to interrogate him at gunpoint and was able to get an address. When George arrived at the address, he sees Patterson's thugs loading his brother's dead body into a car trunk. Fueled by rage and revenge, he headed towards the hideout door, shotgun in hand. Charlie opens the door to leave and gets a belly full of lead. But John hadn't had the reaction you might think. He was kinda upset. His plan was to take down the whole organization, and he had Patterson in the palm of his hands. But George didn't care. The guy had killed his brother. Revenge is all he cared about. And with another tap of the shotgun, he got it. When John arrived back at his apartment, Kit was furious. She told him previously she didn't want to be involved in any of his work. The only thing he said back was that he had to leave for a bit. She told him before he left to clean up the blood off the kitchen floor. He must have been going soft, because if it was anybody else, he would have told them to go to hell. But regardless, he hoped he'd be able to smooth things over with her. Now, remember when I said John had gotten to Gabriel first? Well, Julie had invited Gabriel back to her apartment, and they began to get intimate. It was his first time, and he could never have dreamed how wonderful it could be. She felt like heaven, until he opens his eyes and sees Chantel on top of him, holding his heart. She had tricked Gabriel. There never was a Julie. This was the favor John wanted from Chantel, and she was all for it. He would know how it feels to lose everything, just like she did. Constantine met the both of them at a cemetery. Everything had gone perfectly, except for almost dying earlier. Gabriel wanted to know why. Why do all this to him? Constantine then explains that he was in trouble with the opposition. They were pissed, and now Gabriel would be his mender, whether he liked it or not. He had his heart after all. The only thing left was to do something about those wings, If the angel was going to be working for him, he would have to be less conspicuous. Luckily, John had a way of taking care of that. He began to fire up a chainsaw he had brought in his bag, and had a smile from ear to ear. It seemed he was enjoying all of this. After it was all over, there was no more Snob, no more pride, just a frightened fallen angel lying in the dirt. And this concludes Fear and Loathing. You know, I don't have much to say about this story. It's just kind of a midpoint in the Garth run. Although I will say, it's pretty important. And I do like that Constantine is more of a hero than he was previously. I'm not saying he's a good person, but he's been screwing over all the right people instead of his friends, which has been fun and enjoyable. Also, I just wanted to add that I like that Enos always works causes he cares about into his stories. It never feels performative or forced. He's able to just make it flow, for lack of a better term, which can be very tricky. Not all writers are able to do that, or do it well. And with that, I hope you all enjoyed part 3. I'm going to try and come out with part 4 soon. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and I'll see you next time.